Chapter 21. The Path to Shadows. The road back, the sun hung low on the horizon as Ethan and his party left the gates of Portland, the city shrinking behind them as they traveled toward the outpost. Unlike their first journey, the mood was different. There was no light-hearted banter this time, no complaints from Kara, no casual observations from Leah. Even Gareth, usually the one to keep things focused and efficient, had been quieter than usual, because this time they knew what they were walking into, and none of them were sure if they'd come back. Ethan's thoughts. Ethan moved near the front, eyes scanning the trees that lined the road. It had been only a few days since he had first stepped into the outpost, following a trail of blood into the unknown. And now? They were heading straight back into it. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his new daggers. Twin Shadow Fangs, uncommon, grants plus 5% bonus damage in darkness, slightly reduces enemy perception of the user in low-light environments. They felt right in his hands. But would they be enough? He wasn't just fighting monsters anymore, he was hunting something else, something the system itself couldn't identify. He glanced at Gareth. "What's the plan when we get there?" Gareth didn't answer immediately. Then finally, "We assess first. Check for survivors, see if there are new tracks." His jaw tightened. "And if those things are waiting for us?" Kara answered for him, her voice hard. "We kill them." Simple, but Ethan had a feeling it wouldn't be that easy. A restless camp. They traveled for hours, pushing forward until the sun had dipped beyond the trees. By nightfall, they made camp just off the main road, setting up in a small clearing. Ethan crouched by the fire, watching the flames flicker against the dark. Leah sat across from him, murmuring a quiet spell, letting her mana flow through a small stone as it absorbed residual energy from the environment. Kara leaned against a tree, sharpening her sword with slow, methodical movements, and Gareth stood at the edge of the clearing, spear resting against his shoulder, watching the woods. The silence stretched. Then Leah broke it. "Do you think we'll find anything different this time?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Then finally, "I think we're going to find something worse." Leah frowned, looking up. "You sound sure." Ethan hesitated, then he told them. About the sewers, about the thing he fought, about how it was the same as the creatures from the outpost. Gareth's grip on his spear tightened. Kara had stopped sharpening her sword. Leah's face had gone pale. Ethan finished, exhaling slowly. "I don't think these things are just hiding in dungeons." Gareth exhaled. "I was afraid of that." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Gareth looked at him. "The first few times we fought dungeon creatures, what did they do?" Ethan paused, thinking. "They fought to kill." Gareth nodded. "Exactly. They acted like normal monsters, aggressive, territorial, mindless." He stared into the flames. "But the thing you fought?" His voice was calm but heavy. "It left," Leah whispered. "It was testing you." Ethan nodded. Yeah." Silence fell again. Then Kara scowled, throwing a small rock into the fire. "Great, so now we're fighting smart monsters." Leah exhaled. "Number smarter." Kara scoffed, but there was no real bite in it. Gareth finally sat down, resting his arms on his knees. "Get some sleep," he muttered. "We reach the outpost by midday." Ethan didn't argue, but as he lay back, staring at the stars, he knew none of them were going to sleep well tonight. The outpost revisited. By midday, the outpost was in sight. Ethan stared at it, something cold curling in his gut. It looked exactly the same. Empty. Silent. Undisturbed. As if nothing had ever happened. Gareth motioned with his hand, signaling them to spread out. Kara took the left side, moving toward the storage sheds. Leah checked the barracks, scanning for any traces of mana. Ethan and Gareth moved toward the center. The silence was worse than before. The first time, Ethan had felt an unsettling emptiness. But now he felt like he was being watched. He saw Gareth tense beside him. "You feel that?" Ethan nodded, hand on his dagger. Then, a rustling noise. Both men turned instantly. A figure stumbled out from behind one of the buildings. A man. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, his eyes wide with terror, and the moment he saw them, he collapsed. A survivor. Leah rushed forward before Gareth could even give an order, her hands glowing with soft golden mana as she checked the man's vitals. "He's alive," she breathed. But barely. Ethan crouched beside her. The man's lips were dry, cracked. His breathing was shallow. Then, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment he just stared at them. Then, run. The whisper barely escaped his lips. Ethan's blood turned ice cold. Gareth cursed. "Shit, where's Kara?" A scream. Then, a horrible wet snarl. Ethan's head snapped up. Kara was already moving. And behind her, crawling out from the shadows, were three of them. The shadow touched. Ethan ripped his daggers free. No time to think, no time to run. This time, there was no escape. The fight was already here. Chapter 22. The hunt begins. The ambush. The first snarl cut through the silence like a blade. The shadow-touched emerged from the edges of the outpost, their movements unnatural, almost as if they were gliding rather than walking. Their charred, twisted flesh shifted as they moved, their red eyes glowing with a sickening hunger. Ethan counted 3 of them. No 4. One had just crawled out from the shadows near the barracks. His pulse quickened. They were surrounded. Kara had already drawn her blade, eyes locked onto the closest creature, the one that had come from her side. Gareth gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip on his spear. Leah stood frozen, torn between reaching for her staff or the injured man at her feet. And Ethan? He took a slow breath and tightened his grip on his daggers. There was no running this time. This was a fight, and they had no idea how many would be left standing when it was over. The first clash. The creatures moved first. The one closest to Kara lunged, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. She sidestepped, but the moment she did, the creature's fingers stretched, extending into thin, whip-like claws. Kara barely dodged in time. "Shit!" she hissed, rolling to avoid another slash. Gareth moved next, striking at the one to his right. His spear found its mark, stabbing clean through the thing's shoulder. For a split second it froze, then, without hesitation, it grabbed the spear shaft with its bare hands, and pulled. Gareth was yanked forward off balance as the creature opened its mouth, too wide, revealing jagged, shifting teeth. Leah reacted fast, thrusting a hand forward. Barrier ward activated. A glowing shield of mana slammed into the creature's chest, sending it stumbling back. Gareth ripped his spear free, spinning it into position, but the moment he did, a second creature was already charging from the left. Ethan's instincts kick in. Ethan had no time to think. Shadow step activated, his body blurred, moving instantly to the side as the third creature swiped at where he had just been. He landed behind it and struck. Silent blade activated. His daggers sliced deep, cutting into the thing's side. Dark, tar-like blood spilled onto the dirt. It should have been crippling. But instead, the creature twisted unnaturally, as if its body had no bones. And then, it lashed out, faster than before. Ethan barely ducked under the counterattack, his breath caught. It's adapting. It had already adjusted to his speed. His daggers wouldn't be enough. Not alone. The tide of battle, Gareth held the front line, blocking 2 creatures at once. His spear flashed, but the shadow-touched were getting faster, avoiding his strikes with inhuman flexibility. Kara was engaging the fourth, moving with fluid precision, her sword cutting through the air. But her opponent was predicting her movements, shifting in ways that should have been impossible. Leah was barely keeping up, her healing magic already draining her mana. And Ethan. His mind raced. They couldn't just fight these things head-on. They had to change the approach. A new strategy. Ethan's eyes flicked to the barracks, its entrance wide open. They could funnel the creatures inside, limit their movement, make it harder for them to dodge. He called out, "Gareth, fall back toward the barracks." Gareth didn't argue. He moved immediately, forcing his 2 opponents closer to the entrance. Kara caught on, leading hers in the same direction. Ethan slashed at his own enemy, forcing it back. Then, he ran. The others followed. One by one, the creatures pursued them, snarling, and the moment they were all inside, Leah raised her hand. Barrier ward activated. A wall of mana sealed the entrance. The creatures were trapped. And now, it was time to finish the fight. A brutal finish. Inside the tight space of the barracks, the shadow touched had no room to move. They were fast, but not faster than steel and magic combined. Gareth drove his spear straight through one's skull. Kara severed another's head in a single clean strike. Leah blasted a third with raw, radiant energy, burning it from the inside out. And Ethan? He faced the last one alone. It lunged at him, and he let it. Then, Void Lance activated. A bolt of pure shadow energy erupted from his palm, hitting the creature square in the chest. It screamed, louder than before. Its body shuddered violently. Then, finally, it collapsed. The barracks fell silent, and the fight was over. The aftermath. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ethan's chest heaved, sweat dripping from his brow. Kara wiped blood from her cheek, shaking her head. Gareth exhaled. That was too close. Leah sank to her knees, completely drained. But then, a soft noise made Ethan's head snap up. The survivor. He was still on the ground, his breathing shallow. And now, he was staring at them. His lips trembled. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "They're not the worst thing here." Ethan froze. Gareth narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" The man's hands shook violently. He swallowed hard. "They have a master." The air felt heavier. Ethan's blood turned to ice. "What?" The man's eyes darted toward the far end of the outpost, toward a small ruined building. Then, his voice cracked. "He's still here." Chapter 23. The Master of Shadows. The survivor's warning. The man's words hung in the stale air of the barracks, heavier than the blood still dripping from their weapons. They have a master. He's still here. No one spoke. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on the hilts of his daggers. His body was still running hot from the fight, adrenaline thrumming in his veins. But this? This was something else. Gareth was the first to break the silence. "What do you mean, a master?" The survivor's hands trembled. I don't know," he stammered, "but I saw him. It wasn't like them." His breath hitched. It looked human. A deep, uneasy silence followed. Kara scoffed, but it was forced. "That's ridiculous," she muttered. "You're saying one of these things is—" "What?" "A person." The man swallowed. "Not a person. But it used to be." Ethan's blood turned cold. Leah stepped forward, kneeling beside the man. "Where did you see it?" The survivor raised a shaky hand, pointing toward the ruined building at the far end of the outpost. Ethan followed his gaze. The structure was half collapsed, its stone walls cracked with age. It had been a watchtower once. Now, it was nothing but a grave of forgotten things. And yet, Ethan felt something, a quiet, pulsing wrongness emanating from within the ruins. Like something was waiting, watching. Gareth exhaled sharply, rising to his feet. "We need to check it out." Leah's expression darkened. "Are you sure?" Gareth nodded. "We don't leave unknown threats behind." Ethan tightened his grip on his daggers. "We end this now." Approaching the watchtower, the air grew thick as they made their way toward the ruins. The outpost had been silent before, but now it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Every step was measured. Careful. Ethan's senses were sharp, his perception on high alert. Kara walked beside him, her sword drawn, her usual smirk gone. Leah whispered a soft incantation, weaving mana into a barrier spell, ready to defend if needed. And Gareth? He led them forward, his spear gripped tightly, his eyes focused. Unwavering, the ruined tower loomed before them, its stone walls cracked and covered in creeping vines. Ethan felt it now, a pulse of darkness. Like a faint heartbeat, thrumming in the air. Something was inside, something was awake. A voice in the dark. They stepped past the crumbling threshold, weapons drawn. Inside, the air was colder. Dust swirled in the dim light, the broken ceiling casting long, jagged shadows across the ruined floor. Ethan felt it immediately, the presence, the feeling of something watching. And then, a voice, low, smooth, mocking. "You're late." Ethan's stomach dropped, the others tensed. Kara spun, her sword raised. Leah whispered, "Who?" Then, from the far end of the room, a figure stepped forward. The master revealed. At first glance, he looked human, but Ethan knew better. He was tall and slender, draped in a long, tattered black coat. His skin was ashen grey, as if drained of life, and his eyes, they weren't red. They were void black, swirling with shifting darkness. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The shadow touched had red eyes. But this was something worse. Gareth's voice was low. "Who are you?" The figure tilted his head, a faint smile curling his lips. "No one important," he murmured. His voice was calm, unnervingly smooth, like a blade being sharpened against stone. Just a remnant, a whisper, a shadow of what came before. His gaze swept over them, lingering on Ethan. Though I must say, I'm surprised. Ethan's fingers curled tighter around his daggers. Surprised about what? The man, the master, as the survivor had called him, smiled. That you're still alive. An impossible fight. The moment the words left his lips, he moved. Fast, too fast. 1 second he was standing still. The next, he was right in front of Ethan. Ethan barely had time to react. Shadow step, activated. He blinked backward, dodging by inches. But the master's hand brushed his chest as he moved. And suddenly, Ethan felt like he'd been hit by lightning. Pain exploded through his body, shadows curling along his limbs like smoke made of ice. He gasped, dropping to a knee. Gareth lunged, his spear pierced straight through the master's chest. For a second, it looked like a clean hit, but then the master's body rippled, like a reflection in disturbed water. Gareth's spear passed through him, through nothing. The master laughed softly, predictable. Then he struck back. A wave of black force erupted from his hand, slamming into Gareth's chest. Gareth was flung backward, crashing through a crumbling wooden beam. Kara moved next, her blade flashing. Blade arc activated. A crescent of pure mana shot toward the master. It hit. But he didn't react. Kara's eyes widened. What the fuck? The master stepped forward, unaffected. Leah threw up her hands. Barrier ward activated. A shimmering shield formed around the group. The master paused. Then he smiled. Interesting. The air grew heavier. Ethan forced himself to his feet, his body aching. This wasn't a fight. This was a massacre waiting to happen. They had to get out. Now, the escape. Gareth coughed, pushing himself up. His voice was firm. We're leaving, now. Leah was already pulling mana, reinforcing the barrier. Kara gritted her teeth. And how exactly? Ethan didn't wait. Dark grasp, activated. Shadows erupted from the ground, wrapping around the ruined ceiling, and then he pulled. The entire roof caved in. Dust and rubble filled the air, cutting off their view of the master. Ethan didn't hesitate. Move! They ran, through the ruined entrance, past the bodies, out into the dying light, and behind them, somewhere in the shadows, laughter echoed. Low, amused, and very, very patient. Chapter 24, marked by the abyss. The flight from the watchtower. The sky was a deepening shade of red as Ethan and his team ran. The watchtower collapsed behind them, sending a cloud of stone dust and shattered wood into the air. But even as they gained distance, Ethan knew they weren't safe. Not yet. His body ached, his chest burned where the master had touched him. But there was no time to stop, not while the laughter of that thing still echoed in his ears, not while the weight of its presence still clung to his skin like oil. Kara was breathing heavily beside him, her sword still gripped in white-knuckled fists. Gareth was running wounded, but he didn't slow down. And Leah? She looked exhausted, but her hands still glowed faintly with mana, ready to throw up a barrier at any second. The outpost was behind them now, but Ethan didn't dare look back, because he knew the master was still watching. The unseen chase. The road ahead was a blur of trees and broken ruins. Ethan pushed himself harder, faster, his legs burning with every step. And then, a whisper, faint, wrong. "You can't run from the shadows, little predator." Ethan stumbled mid-stride, his vision blurring for a second. Pain flashed across his chest, searing through his ribs like ice-cold fire. System error, unknown influence detected. Conditions unrecognized, status unstable. Ethan gritted his teeth. The hell does that mean? His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to keep going. If they stopped now, they were dead. Breaking through the tree line, the thick forest finally gave way to open land. Ahead, the faint outline of Portland's outer gates was visible in the fading light. They weren't far now. Gareth glanced back, his expression dark. "Kara, check our rear." Kara, still running, turned her head. Her breath caught. "They're not following." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. That wasn't a relief, that was a warning. Because if the shadow touched weren't chasing them, then they didn't need to. Something worse was coming, and it wasn't in a hurry. That was what scared Ethan the most, because it meant the master had let them go. And that meant he was playing a bigger game. Collapsing at the gates, they reached the city's outer checkpoint just as exhaustion hit them all at once. The guards at the gate looked startled at their condition. One stepped forward. "You look like hell." "What happened?" "We need to see Elias," Gareth said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Now." The guards hesitated, but Gareth's tone left no room for argument. Ethan barely heard the rest of the conversation. His mind was fading in and out, his chest aching worse by the second. Leah was suddenly beside him, gripping his arm. "Ethan?" He tried to say something, but pain. Sharp. Deep, his vision tilted, and then everything went black. Darkness, and the voice within Ethan drifted. Not asleep, not awake, somewhere between. And in that space, a presence, familiar, wrong. "You should have died in that tower, little predator." The voice was inside his mind. Ethan tried to move, but his body wasn't his own. His limbs were trapped in shadows, sinking into an abyss without end. "But I am patient." The voice curled around him, smooth as silk. "You are marked now." A slow pulse of energy burned through his chest. "And soon, you will understand why." Ethan's vision flared white. Waking in the guild hall. He gasped awake, lungs heaving like he had just surfaced from deep water. The world snapped back into focus, the familiar scent of wood, parchment, and burning torches. A bed beneath him, sheets rough against his skin, the guild infirmary. He blinked, his head pounding. Someone was sitting nearby. Leah. Her expression was tight with worry, but the second his eyes opened, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're awake." Ethan exhaled. "How long?" "About half a day." Ethan swallowed. "The others?" "They're fine. Gareth's already talking to Elias." Ethan tried to sit up. A sharp pain ripped through his chest. He winced, pressing a hand to his ribs. Then he froze. His fingers brushed against something. A mark, something etched into his skin, burned into his flesh. "Leah," he said, his voice low. "What the hell happened to me?" Leah hesitated. Then, slowly, she lifted his shirt enough to expose his upper chest. Ethan's breath hitched, because there, right over his heart, was a black sigil. A twisted, swirling mark, shaped like an eye, hidden within shifting shadows. It burned faintly, pulsing with a cold energy. And when Ethan focused on it, a system message appeared. "System error. Unknown mark detected. Information locked. Cannot be removed. Status marked." Ethan's fingers curled into the sheets. Marked by him, by the master of the shadow touched. His stomach twisted. "What the hell does it mean?" Leah looked just as shaken. "I don't know," she admitted. Her voice was quiet. "But whatever it is, I don't think it's going away." A new path and an unseen chain. Ethan let the truth settle over him. He had fought monsters, survived dungeons, barely escaped the shadow touched. But this was different. This was personal. The master had let him go, had marked him for a reason, and Ethan knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, because he wasn't just hunting the darkness anymore. Now, The darkness was hunting him. Chapter 25. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The weight of the mark. Ethan sat on the edge of the infirmary bed, staring at the black sigil burned into his chest. It pulsed with a slow, unnatural rhythm, as if it had its own heartbeat. His heartbeat. The moment he touched it, a sharp, static-like sensation ran through his fingers, not quite pain, but not far from it. Leah watched him from across the room, her expression tight with concern. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Ethan exhaled, lowering his shirt. No, that was a lie. It didn't hurt in the way a wound would, but it felt wrong, like something buried beneath his skin, pressing against his very existence. And the worst part, the system didn't recognize it. System error, unknown mark detected. Information locked, cannot be removed. Status, marked. Ethan clenched his fists. Even the system didn't know what it was, which meant whatever the master had done to him, it was beyond the rules of this world. A deepening concern. Leah was still watching him, her fingers lightly tapping against her arm. "You should let Elias examine it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "The guild doesn't know what this is any more than we do." Leah sighed, rubbing her temples. "They might not know yet. But if this is something dangerous—" "It is dangerous," Ethan cut in, standing. Leah blinked at him, surprised. Ethan turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I don't need them experimenting on me just to confirm that." Leah was silent for a moment. Then, softly, "We're in over our heads, Ethan." Ethan knew that, but he wasn't ready to trust the guild with something he didn't even understand himself. Not yet. First, he needed answers, and for that, he needed to check something. Ethan's status, a growing change. He exhaled, pulling up his system status. The numbers flashed across his vision. Status screen. Name, Ethan Voss. Class, Shadowcaster. Hybrid Assassin Mage. Level, 11 to 12, plus 1 level from recent battle. Health, 340 to 360. Mana, Deca, Stopette. Strength, 25 to 27, plus 2 level gain. Agility, 34 to 36, plus 2 level gains. Endurance, 24 to 26, 2 level gains. Perception, 26 to 28, plus 2 level gains. Mana Control, 12 to 14, plus 2 level gains. Available stat points, 5 new system log from Predator's Absorption. Random stat Absorption, plus 1 strength, plus 2 perception, plus 1 endurance. Skill Absorption. Roll, success, new skill acquired. Ethan stiffened. A new skill. His pulse quickened as he scrolled down, and then, new skill acquired, Umbral Echo, Shadowcaster exclusive, rare rank. Creates a temporary shadow clone that mimics the user's last attack. Clone lasts 3 seconds before fading. Can be used for feints, distractions, or chaining attacks. Mana cost, 50. Cooldown, 30 seconds. Ethan's breath hitched. This was huge. A skill like this meant he could create openings in battle, misdirect enemies, outmaneuver opponents. And the best part, he had absorbed it. Which meant, one of the Shadow Touched had this ability. That sent a chill down his spine, because if he had it now, then that meant they were using it against him before. A meeting with Elias Leah left to get Gareth and Kara. Ethan forced himself to focus, taking a few deep breaths before heading toward the guild's main hall. He needed to stay in control. He needed to make sure the guild didn't find out about the mark. Not yet. By the time he arrived, Gareth and Kara were already seated across from Elias. The guild overseer's expression was grim. "You all look like shit." Kara rolled her eyes. "Nice to see you too, Elias." Elias ignored her, his focus shifting to Ethan. "So," he said, steepling his fingers, "tell me exactly what happened." Ethan sat down, and for the next 10 minutes, they told him everything. When they finished, Elias sat in complete silence. Then finally, he exhaled. "This is worse than I thought." A truth they weren't supposed to know. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You knew something like this existed, didn't you?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, "Not exactly." Kara crossed her arms. "That's vague as hell." Elias sighed. There have been whispers. Whispers? Leah asked. Elias met Ethan's gaze. Disappearing parties. F-ranks going missing. At first, we assumed it was standard dungeon losses. But now, he leaned forward, his eyes hard. Now I think the system is hiding something from us. The room went silent. Leah looked shaken. Gareth's expression remained unreadable. And Ethan? He felt a cold certainty settle in his chest, because this confirmed something he had already suspected. The system was broken, or worse, it was never meant to help them at all. The next move, Elias exhaled. We need information, he said. Kara scoffed. No shit. Elias shot her a look before turning back to Ethan. You saw him. You felt his presence. If we're going to figure out what's happening, you need to retrace your steps. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're asking us to go back? Elias shook his head. Not yet. He tapped his fingers against the desk. There's a place, a library, not in Portland, but in the ruins beyond the northern fields. Old world knowledge. If anything still holds answers about what we're dealing with, it's there. A long pause. Then Gareth spoke. When do we leave? Elias smirked. As soon as you're ready. Ethan's grip tightened. A library with forgotten knowledge, a place where the truth about the shadow touched might be buried. Something about this felt right, like the next piece of the puzzle. And maybe, just maybe, it would tell him what the hell was happening to him. Chapter 26, The Road to Forgotten Knowledge. Ethan stood in the guild hall, the weight of their next mission settling on his shoulders. An ancient library hidden in the ruins beyond the northern fields. A place where forgotten knowledge might hold the key to understanding the shadow touched and the master who had marked him. The system wouldn't recognize these creatures. The guild had no answers. If there was any hope of figuring out what was happening to him, it would be there. And this time, they weren't heading into another dungeon, they were heading into history itself. Preparations begin. Ethan pulled up his status screen one last time before leaving the guild. Status screen. Name, Ethan Voss. Class, Shadowcaster, Hybrid Assassin Mage. Level 12, Health 360 out of 360. Mana, 105 na 105. Strength, 27. Agility, 36. Endurance, 26. Perception, 28. Mana Control, 14. Available stat points, 5 skills. Shadow Step, short-range teleport with momentary invisibility. Silent Blade, enhances melee weapons with shadow energy for extra damage. Dark Grasp, summons shadow tendrils to restrain enemies. Void Lance, launches a piercing bolt of dark energy at enemies. Shadow Cloak, passive, rare. Enhances stealth and reduces enemy perception range. New, Umbral Echo, rare, Shadowcaster exclusive. Creates a temporary shadow clone that mimics Ethan's last attack for 3 seconds. Ethan exhaled. His abilities were growing, but so were his enemies. He allocated his 5 free stat points, boosting Perception +2, Endurance +2, and Mana Control +1. He needed to survive longer. He needed to sense danger before it struck. And most importantly, he needed control. Because whatever was happening to him wasn't normal. And the mark on his chest, it was a constant reminder that something inside him was changing. Meeting at Hollowfang Forge. They agreed to meet at Hollowfang Forge before setting out. The blacksmith, Boros, stood behind the counter, hammering out the finishing touches on Gareth's newly reforged obsidian-tipped spear. Kara inspected her newly enhanced sword, a longer, slightly curved blade enchanted with wind affinity runes for faster strikes. Leah had stocked up on extra mana potions and defensive scrolls. Ethan adjusted the twin shadow fangs at his belt, their black steel reflecting the low forge light. Boros grunted, setting down his tools. You lot are gearing up like you're heading into a war. Gareth glanced at Ethan. We might be. Boros wiped his hands, studying them carefully. If this has anything to do with those things from the sewers, then be careful. Ethan nodded. They didn't know exactly what they were walking into, but they knew what they were looking for. The journey north was different from their past excursions. No dungeons, no system-marked beasts lurking in caves or abandoned ruins. Just open plains, scattered ruins, and a path that had long been forgotten by adventurers. For a while it was quiet. No signs of monsters, no signs of shadow touched. Just the wind whispering through the abandoned landscape. Then, Ethan felt it, a shift in the air, a faint crawling wrongness prickling at the edges of his perception. Stop! Gareth halted instantly. Kara tensed, her fingers tightening around her sword. Leah glanced at him. What is it? Ethan focused, stretching his perception as far as it would go. Then a whisper, faint, distant, not words, just presence. We're not alone, he murmured. As they crested the next ridge, the ruins finally came into view. Once, it had been a great structure. Now it was nothing but stone and collapsed archways, overtaken by twisted, blackened vines. A broken, forgotten place, lost to time, and yet, Ethan could feel it. A deep, pulsing wrongness radiating from within. Like the watchtower, like the sewers, like the master. Gareth adjusted his grip on his spear. Libraries inside that? Leah nodded, scanning the ruins. If it still exists, it'll be underground. We should look for an entrance. Kara sighed, shaking her head. Because that's not ominous at all. Ethan exhaled. He took one step forward, and the moment his foot touched the ruins, the mark on his chest flared. Pain shot through him, sudden and sharp. His vision tilted, and for a brief second, he wasn't standing in the ruins anymore. The world around him shifted. He was somewhere else. The ruins were whole again. Towering black spires stretched toward a blood-red sky. Figures in robes of shifting darkness stood in a circle, whispering in a language Ethan couldn't understand. A door stood before them, a massive, imposing gate of obsidian, chains wrapped around it, pulsing with sickly green runes. And behind that door, a presence, a force so vast, so consuming that Ethan felt his mind teeter on the edge of breaking. You are close now, little predator. The voice echoed in his skull, the whisper of the master. Go deeper. See what they tried to hide. A sharp, cracking sound. The door began to move, something on the other side stirred, and then a hand shot through, dark, unnatural, reaching for him. Ethan gasped, and the vision snapped. He stumbled back, gasping. The ruins were ruined again. The sky was blue, not red. His heart hammered against his ribs. Leah grabbed his arm. Ethan, are you? Ethan inhaled sharply, shaking his head. I saw something. Gareth frowned. What? Ethan looked back at the ruins, and he knew. Whatever was buried here, it had been sealed away for a reason. And now, they were about to break that seal. Chapter 27. The Seal of Forgotten Knowledge. The ruins of the lost library. The sun cast long shadows over the ruins as Ethan and his team stood before the crumbling remains of what was once a grand structure. Pillars lay in scattered heaps, walls collapsed inward, and twisted blackened vines choked the remnants of archways that had once led to knowledge long forgotten. But despite the destruction, there was something alive here. Ethan could feel it. The mark on his chest pulsed, the energy beneath his skin shifting like ink in water. Something in these ruins was reacting to him, or worse, waiting for him. Gareth ran a hand over the edge of a fallen pillar, his expression unreadable. If the library was built underground, there has to be an entrance, he muttered. Leah nodded. These ruins were part of an ancient order. If the records are true, the entrance should be hidden beneath the foundation. Kara sighed. Which means digging through a bunch of collapsed stone. Fantastic. Ethan didn't respond. He was still processing what he had just seen, the vision that had struck him the moment he stepped onto the ruins. A massive obsidian gate, wrapped in chains of pulsing green runes, and something behind it, waking up. His fingers unconsciously brushed over his chest, where the sigil burned beneath his shirt. The master's words echoed in his mind. Go deeper. See what they tried to hide. Ethan swallowed hard. What the hell were they about to uncover? They split up, searching the ruins. Leah examined the scattered remains of symbols and carvings, searching for magical traces. Kara checked the old archways for structural weaknesses. Gareth focused on moving debris, looking for anything that resembled a passage. Ethan, He followed the mark's pull. There was a strange sensation beneath his skin, like a faint whisper guiding him. Step by step, he moved through the ruins, until his foot hit something hollow. He froze, then, slowly, he knelt, brushing away the dirt and debris beneath him. And there, beneath the dust of time, was a stone slab. A door, marked with a symbol identical to the one on his chest. Ethan's breath caught. Found something. The others gathered as Ethan finished unearthing the stone slab. Gareth crouched beside him, running a hand over the surface. "It's not just any door," he muttered. "It's sealed." Leah frowned, pressing her fingers against the etched runes lining the stone. "There's magic here," she whispered. "Old magic, and powerful." Ethan's stomach twisted. Something about this felt wrong. This wasn't just a hidden entrance. It was a barrier, a lock, a warning. And if his mark was connected to this place, did that mean it was meant to be opened? Or meant to be kept shut? The mark reacts. Leah took a step back. "I can try to break the seal, but this magic is ancient. If I mess up—" She hesitated. Kara crossed her arms. "Then let's not mess up." Gareth exhaled. "We don't have a choice. If this is the entrance, we need to open it." Ethan barely heard them, because the moment he placed his hand on the stone slab, the mark on his chest burned. Not just a dull ache, a searing, pulsing pain that sent a shockwave through his entire body. His vision blurred. The whispers returned, faint, echoing, calling. The runes on the stone flickered to life, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. System error. Unknown authorization detected. Bypassing restrictions. Seal breaking. Leah gasped. "Ethan, what did you do?" The runes cracked. The entire ground trembled. And then, with a deep, resonating boom, the stone slab split in half. Dust poured into the air as an ancient staircase spiraled downward, disappearing into the darkness below. Silence followed. Then, Kara sighed. "Well, that's not ominous at all." The air grew colder as they made their way down the stairs. Leah lit a mana orb, casting a soft glow against the rough stone walls. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. It wasn't just stale air, it was pressing, watching, like the very walls were alive with unseen eyes. Ethan's grip tightened on his daggers. Every step felt like crossing a threshold that could never be undone. Then, they reached the bottom. And the library was revealed, the library of the Forgotten Order. The chamber was massive, a cathedral of stone and shadow, stretching further than their light could reach. Towering bookshelves lined the walls, filled with scrolls and tomes covered in dust and age. Columns rose like skeletal remains, their carved surfaces etched with forgotten symbols. And at the far end, a grand podium stood beneath a massive circular archway. And in the center of that archway, chains. Rust-covered, thick as tree trunks, wrapped around an enormous obsidian door. The door Ethan had seen in his vision, the one that had been sealed. And yet, even with the chains still intact, something on the other side was moving. A slow, rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of something asleep, but dreaming. Kara let out a slow breath. "Tell me I'm not the only one who feels that." Leah whispered. "The magic here. It's ancient." Gareth studied the bookshelves. "This place hasn't been touched in centuries." Ethan barely heard them, because he was still staring at the chains wrapped around the black door. The mark on his chest was burning again, not in pain, in recognition. The master's words echoed in his mind. "You are close now, little predator." Ethan clenched his jaw. They had come looking for answers, but they had found something else entirely. And whatever was behind that sealed door, it was waiting. Chapter 28. Reading the Forbidden. A library of the lost. The library of the Forgotten Order stretched before them, a vast and ancient archive buried beneath centuries of ruin. Dust filled the air, disturbed by their movements as they stepped deeper into the cathedral-like space. The bookshelves rose like skeletal ribs, rows of forgotten tomes and crumbling scrolls looming over them. But Ethan's attention wasn't on the books. It was on the massive obsidian door at the far end of the library. Thick chains wrapped around it, their rusted metal covered in arcane symbols that still pulsed faintly with power. And behind it? Something moved. Slow, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something asleep. But aware, his mark burned against his chest. "You are close now, little predator." Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking the master's voice from his thoughts. Gareth was already moving, scanning the rows of shelves with a careful gaze. Kara ran a gloved hand across the spines of old tomes, wrinkling her nose at the layers of dust. Leah stood near the entrance, her fingers barely grazing the surface of a stone pedestal, whispering words of magic as she tried to sense the lingering energy in this place. "This place is—" Leah's voice trailed off, her brows furrowing. "Strange." Gareth gave her a sideways glance. "Strange how?" Leah hesitated, then shook her head. "There's power here, but it's incomplete. Like something was removed." Ethan frowned. "Removed?" Leah's fingers traced the edge of an empty book slot on the pedestal. "This place wasn't just abandoned," she murmured. "Someone tried to erase it." Ethan's stomach tightened. That didn't feel like a coincidence. Kara pulled a thick, leather-bound book from one of the nearby shelves. The cover was worn, the title faded beyond recognition. She flipped it open, only for the pages to crumble into dust. She cursed, shaking the remnants off her fingers. "Well, that's helpful." Gareth sighed. "Check the stone shelves. Older texts are sometimes preserved better there." Leah moved toward one of the archivist's desks, carefully brushing away debris. She squinted at an engraving on the tabletop. Then her breath caught. "I've seen this before." Ethan stepped closer. "Seen what?" Leah pointed to the engraved symbol. It was a swirling sigil, a design of interlocking spirals, forming an eerie eye-like shape. It was identical to the mark on Ethan's chest. Silence fell over the group. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. "This place is connected to them," he muttered. Leah nodded. "This is proof." Gareth exhaled sharply. "Then we need to find out what exactly was studied here." The forgotten records. Leah eventually found a set of stone tablets, stacked neatly in the farthest section of the library. Unlike the books, these were perfectly preserved, almost as if someone had sealed them away from time. She carefully ran her fingers over the ancient runes etched into their surface. "This language is old, older than any recorded kingdom." Kara crossed her arms. "Can you read it?" Leah bit her lip, concentrating. "Parts of it." She took a deep breath and began translating aloud. "When the veil first cracked, the abyss spilled forth. The masters of shadow came bearing their gifts, immortal, unseen, everlasting. The Order of Black Dawn sought to understand their power, but in doing so, they welcomed the curse. A seal was forged, a door was made, and the first war against the abyss began." A long silence followed. Kara's face twisted in confusion. "What the hell does that even mean?" Gareth exhaled, his expression dark. "The veil. The abyss." He looked at Leah. "Does this sound like anything recorded in the history books?" Leah shook her head. "Number this isn't in any of the archives back in Portland." Ethan frowned, glancing toward the sealed door at the far end of the library. A door was made, a seal was forged, and now that seal was cracking. "The chain is weakening." Ethan stepped toward the black door, every instinct in his body screaming not to. The closer he got, the louder the whispers became. "You are almost there. Break the chains. Let us in." Ethan gritted his teeth. The mark on his chest flared, sending a sharp, searing pain through his body. And then, the chains moved, not breaking, not falling, just shifting, like they were reacting to him. A breath of cold air escaped from beneath the cracks, a sliver of darkness. Something beyond this door was alive, and it knew he was here. Ethan staggered back. Leah grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Ethan!" He sucked in a sharp breath, forcing himself to focus. Gareth's gaze was hard. "We need to leave." Ethan looked at him. "But we just got here." "That's exactly why we need to leave," Gareth interrupted. "We came for information. We got it. We don't know what the hell is behind that door, and I'm not about to find out while standing in the middle of its prison." Kara nodded. "For once, I agree. I'd rather not be here when whatever's in there decides to say hello." Ethan hesitated. His gut screamed at him. There was more here. more to understand, more to uncover. But he knew Gareth was right. If they stayed too long, they might never leave. Ethan exhaled. Fine. Leah grabbed a few of the stone tablets, wrapping them carefully in cloth before securing them in her satchel. Gareth started toward the stairs, keeping his spear raised. Or a promise. Kara lingered for a moment, casting one last glance at the black door, then shook her head and followed. Ethan was the last to move. As he turned away from the door, the whispers faded. But one final message echoed in his mind. You will return. You will finish what they started. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure if it was a threat. Chapter 29. A Trail of Shadows. Leaving the library, the journey out of the ruins was tense. Not because they were being chased, not because something had attacked, but because the silence was worse. Ethan could feel it, the weight of something watching them, lingering just beyond the edges of perception. The whispers from the obsidian door had faded, but the mark on his chest still burned. Faintly, steady, like an ember waiting to reignite. And that terrified him, because whatever was sealed behind those chains, it hadn't been speaking to them, it had been speaking to him. On the road again, they left the ruins by midday, retracing their path back toward Portland. Leah carried the stone tablets, carefully wrapped in cloth. Gareth led the way, keeping them moving at a steady pace. Kara walked at the rear, her sword loose in her grip, eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan kept his head down, deep in thought. They had found more than just knowledge. They had found proof that the shadow touched weren't just a new phenomenon. They had existed long before the system descended. And worse, people had tried to study them, understand them, and in doing so, they had nearly destroyed themselves. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his chest where the sigil pulsed beneath his shirt. He had a bad feeling about what was coming next, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answers. They made camp just before sunset, setting up in a clearing near a river. Ethan sat near the edge of the fire, sharpening his daggers. The twin shadow fangs gleamed under the flickering light, their black steel reflecting the embers. Kara stretched her arms, letting out a long breath. Well, that was sufficiently horrible. Leah gave her a tired look. You say that about every mission. Because every mission is horrible, Kara shot back, especially when they involve ancient cursed ruins and possibly evil magic doors. Gareth, who had been silent most of the trip back, finally spoke. We need to decide what we're telling Elias. That killed the conversation immediately. Ethan glanced up. Leah shifted. We have to tell him something. The guild has a right to know. Kara scoffed. You think they'll believe us? That we found some secret ancient order experimenting with monsters the system won't even register? She shook her head. No chance. Gareth exhaled. We tell them about the library. We tell them about the records we found, but we don't mention... He hesitated. The door. Ethan frowned. You think they'll try to open it? Gareth nodded. If we give the guild a reason to investigate, they'll send someone, and we have no idea what happens if that seal breaks. Ethan looked down at his chest. He had a feeling he knew exactly what would happen. And it wouldn't be good. The others settled in, taking turns on watch. Ethan took the last shift, sitting by the dying fire as the night stretched on. The stars were bright, the world quiet, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The air felt too still, the trees too silent. Then, a flicker of movement in the darkness. Ethan's grip tightened on his daggers, his perception spiked, stretching outward. And for a brief moment he felt it. Not a monster, not a beast, something human-shaped, watching, waiting, just beyond the tree line, and then... gone. Like it had never been there. Ethan exhaled slowly. If someone was tracking them, it wasn't just the shadow touched anymore, it was something else, something new. And that was almost worse. They reached Portland by midday, passing through the city gates without issue. But the guild hall was different this time. Ethan noticed it the second they stepped inside. The air was tense. Adventurers sat in tight clusters, speaking in hushed voices. There was an undercurrent of unease. Something had happened. And then, a familiar voice. Ethan. Elias Thurman stood near the guild's mission board, arms crossed. His sharp grey eyes studied them carefully. "You're back." Ethan nodded. Elias motioned toward the private meeting room. "Let's talk." A partial truth. Elias listened in silence as they relayed the events at the library ruins. They told him about the ancient records, the Order of Black Dawn, and the studies on the Shadow Touched. But they didn't mention the obsidian door or the chains holding it shut. Elias sat back when they finished, his fingers tapping against the table. "This changes things," he murmured. Leah frowned. "You believe us?" Elias sighed. "I've heard stories before, stories about things older than the system." He looked at Ethan. "And I know you're not lying." Ethan stiffened slightly. "What do you mean?" Elias's gaze flickered toward his chest. "You've changed," he said simply. Ethan's pulse spiked. Did he know about the mark? Did he see it? But Elias didn't press. Instead, he exhaled. "There's something you need to know." He leaned forward. "While you were gone, another team went missing." Silence. Kara's expression darkened. "Another one?" Elias nodded. "A high-ranked party, sent to investigate the Eastern Forest ruins." Leah frowned. "But we just came from the north. Are you saying—" "They never reported back," Elias said. His next words were calm, even, but heavy. "We think they ran into the same things you did." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This wasn't just one incident. It was spreading. The Shadow Touched, the disappearances. The guild was starting to realize something was wrong. But Ethan already knew the truth. This wasn't just getting worse, it had already begun. And the Master was waiting for him to realize it. Chapter 30, A Widening Abyss. A world on edge. Ethan stood in the guild's private meeting room, his mind racing. Another party had vanished. The guild was starting to notice the pattern, but they were still missing the truth. The Shadow Touched weren't just random anomalies. They weren't dungeon creatures. They weren't even supposed to exist. And yet, they were multiplying, spreading. And Ethan knew deep in his bones that the Master's influence was growing with them. The obsidian door in the library ruins had been sealed for a reason. But if these disappearances meant what he thought they did, then something was breaking those seals. And soon, they wouldn't just be hunting Shadow Touched, they'd be fighting whatever came next. The guild's response. Elias exhaled, rubbing his temple as he looked at Ethan's team. "You're telling me you found evidence that the Shadow Touched existed before the system?" Leah nodded. The records were clear. They were known as Masters of Shadow. The Order of Black Dawn studied them, tried to contain them. Kara crossed her arms, and failed, apparently. Elias didn't argue. Instead, he looked at Ethan. "What do you think?" Ethan hesitated, then quietly. "I think history is repeating itself." Elias narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Ethan's fingers tensed around his belt. "The Ancient Order tried to stop them, tried to lock them away." His voice dropped lower, but they didn't succeed. Elias was silent. Then, finally, he leaned forward. "I want you four to investigate the eastern ruins." Ethan blinked. "That's where the missing party went." Elias nodded. "If these disappearances are connected, we need to know why." His grey eyes sharpened. "We need to know what we're up against." A new mission, the Eastern Ruins mission. Type, Investigation and Recovery Objective. Locate missing high-rank adventurers. Secondary objective, identify any new Shadow-touched activity. Location, abandoned ruins deep within the Eastern Forest. Estimated threat level, unknown. Ethan and his team left the meeting with heavy thoughts. "We're running straight into another cursed ruin," Kara muttered. "This is becoming a habit." Gareth sighed. "It's worse than that. If we don't figure this out, we're going to start seeing Shadow-touched inside city walls." That thought made everyone pause. Leah swallowed. "Then we better be ready." Kara visited the weaponsmith, reinforcing her sword with a sharper mana-conductive edge. Arith replaced his damaged armor, upgrading to a reinforced chestplate. Leah stocked up on potions, scrolls, and mana restoration elixirs. Ethan went to Boros. The blacksmith looked up as Ethan entered the Hollow Fang forge. Back already? Ethan set his twin shadow fangs on the counter. I need them upgraded. Boros studied him for a long moment. Then, with a knowing grunt, he took the daggers. I'll see what I can do. Ethan exhaled. He had a feeling he was going to need every advantage he could get. The eastern ruins were a day's travel from Portland. The first half of the journey was uneventful. No monsters, no signs of other adventurers, no attacks. But the silence was almost worse. The deeper they traveled, the heavier the air became. The sky seemed darker, even in daylight. The trees twisted slightly, their branches curling in unnatural angles. And worst of all, the system notifications stopped. No new location discovered, no danger level alerts. It was as if the system itself refused to acknowledge this place. That sent a chill through Ethan's bones. Does anyone else feel that? Kara muttered. Leah nodded. It's like the air is watching us. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a missing persons mission, this was a warning. And they had already stepped past the threshold. By mid-afternoon, they reached the first signs of the lost adventurers. Footprints in the dirt, leading toward the ruins. A discarded guild-issued dagger, half buried in mud. Faint traces of mana residue, evidence of a battle. Gareth knelt, running a hand over the dagger. This belonged to one of the missing party members, he muttered. Ethan frowned. They made it here, but they didn't come back. Leah's fingers tightened on her staff. They were fighting something, and that meant they were walking into the same fight. Ethan exhaled, gripping his daggers. Then they pushed forward. The ruins appeared just past the tree line, crumbling stone walls, half covered in moss. A massive circular courtyard, worn symbols carved into the ground, statues of cloaked figures, their faces long since eroded. And in the center of the ruins, a staircase leading underground. The entrance was wide open. Kara scowled. That's not a good sign. Gareth nodded. They went down there. Leah's hands trembled slightly. There's something wrong with this place, she whispered. Ethan didn't argue. He felt it too. The mark on his chest throbbed, the same way it had in the library ruins. This wasn't just an ancient ruin, it was another sealed site. And if the shadow touched were here, that meant something was trying to get out. They stepped into the ruins. The air grew heavier. The moment Ethan's foot touched the first step of the staircase, the whispers returned. Ah, you've come again. Ethan froze. It wasn't the master's voice, it was something else, something older, something buried deep beneath these ruins. His breath came out shaky. This wasn't just another forgotten place, this was something far worse. And by stepping into it, they had already awakened something waiting inside.